The story of weapons begins not on battlefields, nor in the hands of kings, but in the fragile days when humans were prey. Around 2 million years ago, in the shifting savannas of East Africa, small bands of early hominins struggled to survive. They had no claws, no fangs, and no speed to match the predators that stalked the grasslands. Their bodies were fragile compared to the lions, leopards, and saber-toothed cats that shared their world. What they did have was an awareness that survival demanded more than instinct. It demanded innovation. Archaeological evidence shows that one of humanity's earliest ancestors, Homo habilis, literally the handy man, was among the first to shape stone for use. In sites such as Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, chip rocks have been uncovered with sharp edges worn by use. These were not naturally broken stones, but deliberately flaked tools. They marked a turning point in the history of life on Earth. For the first time, a species had taken an object from nature and changed it into something new, something with purpose. The first stone tools were basic, cores and flakes. A hominin would strike one rock against another, knocking off sharp fragments. Those fragments, crude though they were, could slice through animal hide, scrape meat, or break open bones for marrow. To predators, these tasks were effortless. To humans, they meant access to calories that teeth and nails alone could not provide. The stone tool, in its simplicity, gave a weak species an advantage that began to alter the balance of survival. It was not yet a weapon in the sense we understand, but survival blurred the line between tool and weapon. A sharp-edged stone, when hurled in desperation, could wound. A flake grasped tightly could slash. A branch tipped with stone could pierce flesh. In those fragile experiments lay the origins of the spear, the knife, and eventually the sword. One can imagine a moment, a predator lunging, a human cornered, and in fear, a stone thrown. Whether it struck or missed, the idea itself had emerged. That distance could be weaponized, that defense could be turned into offense. From that point forward, stone was no longer just a tool of the hand. It was an extension of will. Archaeologists call these earliest implements the Olduvai industry, dating back about 2.6 million years. Their rough surfaces bear the story of trial and error, of minds learning that one strike at the right angle could shape edges sharper than nature ever offered. The survival of these artifacts across millennia tells us that they were kept, carried, and used. They were not accidents. They were a deliberate step toward control. The leap from scavenger to hunter was not immediate. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans still cower from larger beasts. Yet the tools they carried gave them courage. In time, those tools became more sophisticated. The Acheulean hand axe, appearing around 1.7 million years ago, shows a new mastery. Symmetrical, teardrop-shaped, with sharper edges crafted through patient chipping. Unlike the Olduvai flakes, these axes were multi-purpose instruments, cutting, scraping, chopping, digging. Their very design suggests planning, foresight, and a sense of permanence. Stone tools are fossils of the human mind, wrote the archaeologist Louis Leakey, whose discoveries in Africa helped illuminate this early chapter of human history. In their crude forms, we see not only survival but imagination. Each strike of stone against stone was a step away from the instinct-driven life of other animals and a step towards something uniquely human, the capacity to shape the world. Weapons, then, were born not out of glory or conquest, but out of fear. Each predator's roar in the night, each rustle in the brush, was a reminder of vulnerability, and each new edge carved into stone was a declaration against that fear. The chipped hand axe was more than a survival tool. It was a symbol that the weak would not remain powerless. These developments were not confined to one region. Evidence of similar tools appears across Africa, spreading as early humans migrated. Sites in Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa all preserve traces of this technological awakening. What unites them is the same story. The fragile human body, armed with nothing but ingenuity, finding strength in stone. The tools also change social life. They could be shared, taught, and improved upon. A child could learn from a parent how to strike the right angle, how to find the right stone. Knowledge became inheritance. Culture began to form around these fragments of flint and basalt. The human story was no longer written only in blood and bone. It was being written in stone. Yet the spark that began with chipped rock would not remain there. As generations passed, tools became weapons, and weapons became strategies. Fear turned to advantage, and advantage to power. What began as a trembling hand with a stone became the foundation of hunting, defense, and ultimately, war. The first edge cut more than flesh. It carved a new path for humanity. With every strike, humans declared that they would no longer accept the role of prey. The chipped stone was the beginning of resistance, the moment when survival ceased to be passive and became a battle fought with invention. And so, from the savannas of Africa to the caves of Europe and Asia, a fragile species began its long ascent. Each stone tool was not just a mark of survival, but a glimpse of destiny, that one day, weapons forged in fear would shape the fate of empires. The spark in stone was lit, and in its glow, humanity found the will to fight back. For early humans, the sun's descent was a sentence of dread. Daylight gave some measure of protection, but when night fell, every sound in the dark became a threat. The rustle of leaves, the growl of unseen predators, even the silence itself carried terror. Without the sharp vision of cats or the scent of wolves, humans were vulnerable. The night was their greatest enemy. The turning point came not with muscle or speed, but with the master of an element older than humanity itself, fire. It is impossible to know the first moment a human confronted flame. Perhaps it was lightning striking a tree or lava spilling across a plain. The fire was at once danger and wonder. Most animals fled from it, but humans, curious and desperate, edged closer. What began as a cautious fascination grew into one of history's most decisive revolutions. Archaeological traces of early fire use stretch back more than 1 million years. In Kenya's Kubi Fora and South Africa's Wonderwork Cave, layers of ash and burned bone remain, silent witnesses to a discovery that reshaped existence. Fire was not simply warmth. It was protection, transformation, and above all, power. Predators that once dominated the night kept their distance from flame. A ring of fire outside a cave became an invisible wall. For the first time, humans could push back against the darkness, not with claws or teeth, but with light. Around the embers, fear loosened its grip. The night, once a time of hiding, became a time of gathering. But fire did more than ward off beasts. It changed the very nature of human survival. Meat, once gnawed raw, could now be cooked. The process unlocked calories, softened fibers, and killed parasites. Diets improved, illnesses lessened, and bodies grew stronger. Cooked food required less effort to chew and digest, allowing energy to be directed elsewhere, including the brain. Many scientists believe this was a crucial step in the growth of human intelligence. Fire, in this way, not only fed the body but expanded the mind. Weapons, too, were reborn in flame. Wooden spears, when hardened in fire, became deadlier. A charred tip, blackened and firm, pierced more deeply than untreated wood. With this technique, the hunt transformed. A spear thrust in defense became a calculated strike in offense. Predators were no longer the only hunters of the plains. Humans, with fire and sharpened wood, entered the circle of dominance. At archaeological sites like Skåningen in Germany, researchers have uncovered spears dating back 400,000 years. Their pointed ends bear marks of deliberate fire hardening. Alongside them lie the bones of horses, proof that early humans used these weapons not just to scavenge but to hunt large animals in groups. Here was the first evidence of coordinated strategy, the recognition that fire and weapon, used together, could alter the balance of life and death. The cultural impact of fire was just as profound. Around campfires, humans found more than safety. They found one another, stories, gestures, and the first forms of language grew in these circles of light. Fire extended the day, giving time for teaching and planning. It turned scattered individuals into communities. It gave rhythm to existence. Hunt by day, gather by night, remember and imagine by the fire. Fire is the best of servants, but the worst of masters, an old proverb reminds us. Even in prehistory, the danger was clear. Flames that protected could also consume. Entire landscapes could burn, and in that destruction lay a lesson. Power had consequences. Yet despite the risk, humans never let go. They learned to carry embers from one camp to the next, to strike sparks with stone, to make fire not by chance but by will. The mastery of fire was humanity's first true conquest of nature. It was the taming of an element, the bending of the environment to human need. In doing so, humans discovered not only protection, but confidence. They were no longer the trembling figures in the shadows. They were figures with torches, shaping the dark to their advantage. Weapons reflected this change. No longer just extensions of stone, they became extensions of fire. Spears blackened by flame, clubs hardened at their tips. Even the first crude torches used to drive animals into traps. All were signs that humans were learning to combine nature's forces with their own ingenuity. A new relationship had begun. Humans as creators, not just survivors. The archaeological record in India's Narmada Valley in the caves of Bhimbetka provides evidence of fire use stretching back tens of thousands of years. Hearts filled with ash, bones charred by flame, stone tools found alongside burned fragments. All speak of species that had discovered how to control fear itself. With fire, nights grew shorter, hunts grew bolder, and weapons grew sharper. The transformation was more than physical. Fire gave humans a sense of destiny. To control fire was to control time, to mark the boundary between the wild and the human. Around flames, songs and symbols began to form. The first sparks of culture flickered in the glow. From chipped stone to sharpened wood, and from wood to fire, the pattern was clear. Each step forward in human history was a step further from weakness. Each innovation turned fear into power. Fire did not erase danger, but it shifted the balance. By the time humans spread out of Africa into Europe and Asia, they carried more than tools. They carried fire in their hands, in their minds, and in their stories. And with it, they carried weapons that would define the future. The night was no longer an endless threat. With fire, humanity had conquered its greatest fear. Yet with each new conquest came new ambition. If stone and fire could protect and feed, what more could be achieved? The answer would come with a weapon that allowed humans not just to defend or survive, but to strike from afar. The bow and the hunt were waiting on the horizon. By the time early humans had mastered fire, they had already shifted the balance of power on the savannas. But danger remained. Hunting at close range was still perilous. A spear demanded proximity, and proximity to a charging bison or a cornered lion was often fatal. The next great breakthrough came not from strength, but from distance. Humans learned to strike without closing the gap, and in doing so, they reshaped the very logic of survival. Archaeological discoveries suggest that the bow and arrow first appeared between 60 and 40,000 years ago. In South Africa's Sabudu Cave, tiny stone points were microscopic, where patterns reveal that they were once hafted onto shafts and launched with force. This was a revolution not of material, but of imagination. The bow transformed human hunting into strategy. With a single invention, the body's reach was multiplied many times over. The bow was deceptively simple, a bent piece of wood strung with sinew or fiber, storing energy when pulled and releasing it in an instant. But its implications were immense. Hunters could now strike from cover, concealed in brush or perched above trails. They no longer had to match muscle with muscle. An arrow, loose from a distance, pierced with speed no hand could throw. For the first time, humans became predators of range. With this shift, hunting itself changed character. No longer did survival depend on brute force alone. It depended on planning, coordination, and patience. Archaeological sites in Europe and Asia show evidence of communal hunts, where groups worked together to drive animals toward ambush points. Some scattered, some waited, and when the time came, arrows flew in volleys. The bow required not just skill, but trust. It made the hunt a collective endeavor. Language, too, may have deepened in these moments. To coordinate, hunters needed more than gestures. They needed words, instructions, warnings, strategies. You take the right flank. I will circle from the left. Such exchanges, invisible in the archaeological record but echoed in human evolution, were sharpened by the demands of the bow. Communication itself became a weapon. The cultural resonance of the bow, an arrow would echo for millennia. In India's rock shelters at Bhimbetka, paintings dating back thousands of years depict hunters with drawn bows, poised to release. In Europe's Paleolithic caves, etched images of arrows suggest their role not only in subsistence but in identity. The bow was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of human ingenuity, of a mind that could see beyond the body's limits. Over time, bows grew more sophisticated. Arrows were tipped not only with sharpened stone, but with bone, antler, and eventually metal. Feathers were added for stability, poisons for lethality. Each refinement extended the weapon's effectiveness, but its essence remained unchanged, the harnessing of stored energy to project force at distance. Quivers of arrows made hunters mobile. They could stalk silently, conserving strength, and strike when opportunity arose. The risk of closing in with a spear diminished. So did the balance of power between human and beast. What had once been dangerous prey, large game like deer, elk, or even mammoth, could now be taken from relative safety. The bow made possible not only survival, but abundance. Its role, however, soon extended beyond the hunt. As human groups grew and land became contested, the bow became a weapon of defense and conflict. The same arrows that struck deer could strike rivals. The same coordination used in hunts could be turned against human enemies. The bow thus entered the realm of society and politics. It was no longer just about feeding families. It was about protecting them and about claiming territory. Later traditions would elevate the bow into legend. In the Indian epics, the bow is more than a weapon. It is a spiritual emblem. Rama's Kodanda and Arjuna's Gandiva were not merely instruments of war, but symbols of dharma, justice, and cosmic order. In cultures across the world, from the longbows of England to the composite bows of Central Asia, mastery of the bow became mastery of destiny. Yet even in its earliest days, the bow was transformative because it redefined what it meant to be human. It was proof that weakness could be overcome by vision. The hunter crouched in the brush, bowstring drawn, was not stronger than the animal he stalked, but he was more deliberate, more patient, and more connected to his community. The bow embodied foresight, precision, and the will to extend power beyond the body. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Stellmore in Germany, where wooden arrow shafts dating back over 10,000 years were preserved in peat bogs, confirms the continuity of this weapon through time. Across continents, variations of the bow appeared, adapted to landscapes, materials, and traditions. What remained constant was a principle: strike from a distance and change the terms of survival. The bow marked a turning point in humanity's relationship with fear. With stone and fire, humans had defended themselves. With the bow, they seized initiative. They could shape outcomes, dictate encounters, and, for the first time, dominate not only the ground they stood on, but the space beyond it. By the end of the Stone Age, the bow and arrow had spread across continents. Whether in the forests of Africa, the plains of Europe, or the river valleys of Asia, it became the universal symbol of a species that had learned to control both distance and destiny. From chipped stone to hardened spear, and from spear to bow, each step forward had been a step away from vulnerability. The bow carried humanity out of the shadows of fear and into the first stages of organized power. But as people settled, farmed, and built permanent villages, weapons would take on a new role. They would no longer be only for the hunt or for defense. They would become instruments of property, borders, and rule. The age of villages and kingdoms was about to begin. By 10,000 years ago, the world was changing. The great hunt that had defined humanity for millennia began to give way to something new: farming. In fertile valleys, humans planted seeds, tended fields, and raised animals. They built huts and granaries, no longer wandering endlessly in search of food. Villages emerged, small clusters of homes tied to land and harvest. And with permanence came new dangers, not only from the wild, but from one another. Weapons, once tools of the hunt, began to take on a different meaning. A spear at the edge of a village was no longer meant only for deer or antelope. It was a symbol of defense, a warning to rivals, a claim to territory. What had been survival in the wilderness became security within boundaries. Archaeological sites like Catalhoyuk in Anatolia and Mehrgar in South Asia revealed this transformation. Alongside farming implements, researchers have uncovered fortified walls, watchtowers, and evidence of conflict. Villages were no longer just places of cooperation. They were targets, rich with grain, livestock, and resources worth fighting for. To protect these new assets, communities leaned more heavily on weapons. The bow and spear, once instruments of subsistence, were adapted into instruments of power. Villagers organized patrols. They placed guards at entrances. The need to defend land and food shaped the rhythm of daily life. It was not enough to grow crops. One had to protect them. In this way, weapons began to define not only survival, but society itself. As villages grew, so did conflict. Neighboring groups competed over water, pasture, and fertile ground. The same rivers that nourished fields became contested borders. And in these disputes, weapons were decisive. A handful of archers could decide whether a harvest was kept or stolen. A line of spearmen could repel or collapse under attack. Security became a collective responsibility, and weapons were at its core. This was the dawn of organized violence. The evidence lies in skeletons unearthed at prehistoric sites, bearing marks of arrows and blades. Mass graves from the Neolithic show that raids and battles were not exceptions, but recurring realities. Human beings, who once huddled together against predators, now turned weapons on each other in defense of land, honor, or survival. Yet weapons also became symbols of leadership. The man who carried the sharpest spear or commanded the most skilled archers gained authority. Villages began to look to leaders not only for wisdom but for protection. And as leadership crystallized, weapons moved from the hands of individuals to the service of power. Chiefs became protectors, but also rulers. The seed of kingship was sown in the sharpened edge of stone and the tension of a drawn bowstring. By around 5000 BCE, this pattern had spread across fertile regions of the world. The Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Yellow River in China all saw the same cycle. Villages clustering, fields expanding, and conflicts rising. To survive in these cradles of civilization, communities needed more than food. They needed defense. And defense demanded organization, loyalty, and weapons. The earliest fortifications testify to this new reality. At Jericho, one of the oldest known settlements, archaeologists discovered a stone wall and a massive tower dating back more than 9,000 years. These structures were not for hunting. They were for protection. Behind them lay not just homes, but the first outlines of society organized around defense. Weapons now carried meaning beyond the battlefield. They became cultural emblems. Stone axes buried alongside chiefs, flint daggers placed in graves, arrowheads stored in sacred spaces. All signaled that weapons were not only tools but symbols of identity and prestige. To wield one was to hold power, and to pass one down was to preserve legacy. As societies grew more complex, weapons expanded their role in shaping justice. Disputes within a village might be settled with duels, or by shows of arms that reinforced authority. The presence of weapons in rituals and ceremonies gave them weight in defining law and order. Violence, once random, became regulated. In this way, weapons became instruments not just of fear, but of governance. But the greatest transformation came when villages united or conquered each other. Tribes grew, alliances formed, and gradually, the first kingdoms emerged. Rulers used weapons not only to defend borders, but to extend them. What had been raids became wars of expansion. Spears and arrows, once used to guard harvests, now determined the fate of entire territories. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians built city-states defended by militias armed with spears, axes, and bows. Their kings, like Gilgamesh, were remembered as warriors as much as rulers. In Egypt, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under Narmer was symbolized by images of the pharaoh smiting enemies with mace, a weapon turned into an icon of authority. In the Indus Valley, though less is known, fortifications and standardized weaponry suggest organized defense and perhaps early state structures. Weapons defined not only the rulers but the ruled. Farmers became soldiers in times of need, bound to protect their communities. Young men trained in hunting were taught to fight for their villages. Women and children bore the consequences of raids and wars. Society itself was structured around the need to arm and defend. The bow, once loose against deer, now loosed against men. The spear, once thrust at prey, now thrust at rivals. Humanity had crossed a threshold. Weapons were no longer only about survival in nature. They were about survival in society. This was the era when the foundations of civilization were laid: agriculture, architecture, writing, and governance. But all of it rested on the quiet presence of weapons. Fields could be plowed, temples could be built, and cities could rise only if borders were defended. The spear at the village gate was as important as the plow in the field. And as kingdoms grew, so did ambition. The next great transformation was already taking shape. For once humans learned to shape not just stone but metal, weapons would cease to be symbols of local power and become instruments of empire. The leap from stone to metal was one of the greatest transformations in human history. For millennia, stone had served well enough. Chipped, sharpened, shaped into spears and axes. But stone had limits. It fractured unpredictably, dulled quickly, and demanded constant replacement. Around 3300 BCE, in Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Nile Valley, humans discovered a new secret. When certain rocks were heated in fire, they melted into liquid and could be reshaped. This was not an accident or chance. It was a deliberate birth of metallurgy. The earliest of these metals was copper, soft and workable, but too weak for lasting weapons. The breakthrough came with bronze, an alloy of copper and tin. Stronger, sharper, and more durable, bronze was a material that reshaped not just weapons but entire civilizations. Archaeological finds from Sumerian city-states reveal bronze-tipped spears, socketed axes, and daggers. These weapons were more reliable than their stone predecessors, but more importantly, they could be mass-produced. With bronze, armies could be equipped on a scale previously impossible. The Bronze Age saw the rise of the first great empires. In Mesopotamia, Sargon of Akkad forged one of the earliest large kingdoms, commanding soldiers armed with bronze weaponry. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom fielded armies with bronze-tipped arrows, battle axes, and scale armor. In the Indus Valley, standardized weights and measures extended to weapon production, ensuring uniformity in tools of war. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaeans and Minoans built warrior cultures centered on bronze swords and shields. The metal was not merely a material. It was a currency of power. Weapons now became symbols of kingship. The mace head of Narmer in Egypt, ceremonial bronze axes buried with Sumerian rulers, and the ornate swords found in Mycenaean tombs all testify to this new association. To rule was to control metal. To hold a bronze blade was to hold legitimacy. The consequences rippled across society. For the first time, war became professionalized. Armies no longer consisted only of farmers who fought seasonally. They became standing forces, trained and equipped with bronze weapons, sustained by the agricultural surplus of their civilizations. Siege warfare emerged, with battering rams, fortified walls, and organized formations. The battlefield was no longer a chaotic clash of hunters. It was a stage for strategy. Yet bronze had a vulnerability. Tin. Unlike copper, which was abundant, tin was scarce and often located far from centers of power. Trade routes stretched across continents to bring the two metals together. From the mines of Central Asia to the shores of Cornwall, tin was sought after like gold. Control of these routes meant control of bronze. When supply chains faltered, empires weakened. The fragility of dependence shaped the geopolitics of the Bronze Age. By around 1200 BC, the world shifted again. Across the eastern Mediterranean, civilizations collapsed in a wave of destruction. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean palaces burned, Egyptian power faltered, and the mysterious sea peoples raided coastlines. The Bronze Age ended in fire and ruin, but from its ashes rose a new discovery: iron. Iron was far more abundant than tin. Once humans learned to smelt it at high temperatures, iron weapons spread rapidly. Stronger and sharper than bronze, iron democratized warfare. No longer limited by scarce resources, even smaller states could arm large forces. The Iron Age was the age of expansion, of empires built not only by kings but by peoples. The Assyrians were among the first to grasp the full potential of iron. From the 9th century BCE, they built an empire on the back of iron swords, lances, and armor. Their armies marched with unprecedented discipline, using siege engines to batter city walls, iron-tipped arrows to rain death, and cavalry armed with long iron lances to break enemy lines. Assyrian reliefs carved in stone depict these conquests with chilling clarity. Cities burned, prisoners impaled, rulers kneeling before the king. Iron gave them not only dominance, but terror. In India, iron tools and weapons spread to the Ganges Valley around 1200 BC, aiding the growth of agriculture and the rise of new states. The Mahajanapadas, early kingdoms of the subcontinent, fielded armies with iron-tipped arrows and spears. In China, the Zhou dynasty advanced with iron weaponry, setting the stage for centuries of warfare among warring states. Across Europe, Celtic tribes became renowned for their iron swords, spreading their influence across the continent. Iron changed the scale of war. Larger armies could be fielded. Cities built higher walls, but iron siege weapons grew stronger still. The clash between offense and defense became relentless, fueling technological arms races that echo even into the present. Weapons also shaped identity and myth. The Greek hoplite spear and shield, the Roman legionary's gladius, the Indian warrior's iron-tipped bow, the Persian immortal's blade, each became a symbol of its culture's strength. Literature and legend enshrined these weapons. Achilles' bronze spear in Homer's epics, the mighty bow of Arjuna in the Mahabharata, the iron swords wielded by heroes in Norse sagas. To remember a people was often to remember their weapons. Yet the age of bronze and iron was not only about conquest, it was also about transformation. Weapons became tools of empire, but also of resistance. When Alexander marched east with iron and steel, Indian kingdoms met him with their own weapons. When the Romans expanded, tribes armed with iron resisted. Every empire that rose with iron eventually faced its fall to iron. This era marked a permanent shift. Weapons were no longer just responses to fear or hunger. They were instruments of ambition, expansion, and ideology. They determined not only who survived, but who ruled, who was enslaved, and who was remembered. The Iron Age set the template for centuries to come. Empires forged by metal, defended by armies, and remembered by the clash of weapons. Yet even as iron spread, a new force was stirring, one that would change the very sound of war. The quiet arc of arrows and the clash of swords would give way to thunder. The discovery of gunpowder was approaching, and with it, the beginning of an age where weapons would reshape not just kingdoms, but the world itself. By the height of the Iron Age, weapons were no longer just tools of necessity. They had become the very language of power. Kings ruled with scepters in one hand and swords in the other. Armies marched not merely to defend borders, but to expand them, to project authority, and to leave their mark upon history. The blade, once chipped from stone in fear, now gleamed in iron and steel as a symbol of conquest and legacy. In Greece, the hoplite spear and short iron sword defined an era of citizen soldiers. Rows of men stood shield to shield, their weapons binding them into phalanxes that decided the fate of city-states. At Marathon and Thermopylae, blades and spears determined whether Greece would remain free from Persia. In Rome, the legionary's gladius carved an empire from Britain to Mesopotamia. These weapons were standardized, mass-produced, and disciplined in use, extensions of a state that demanded loyalty and rewarded order. But weapons were never only instruments of the state. They were personal legacies, carried into battle and often buried with their owners. In Celtic Europe, warriors were laid to rest with iron swords by their sides, a final testament to honor and identity. In India, bows strung with iron-tipped arrows became symbols of divine duty, immortalized in the Mahabharata. In Japan, the forging of the sword grew into an art form, the katana embodying not only martial skill, but spiritual devotion. Everywhere, weapons became markers of what it meant to live, to fight, and to die. The legacy of the blade was not only written in glory, but in devastation. The Assyrians, with their iron weapons, imposed terror as a strategy of empire. Their reliefs depict prisoners flayed or impaled, a grim reminder that the sword could secure rule through fear as well as loyalty. In China, the Warring States period saw armies clash endlessly with iron weapons until Qin unified the land under one ruler. Here, the blade was the agent not of stability, but a relentless struggle. Yet alongside violence, weapons carried ideals. To the Greeks, the spear and shield were symbols of citizenship, each man's duty to defend his polis. To the Romans, the gladius represented discipline, the steel backbone of an empire. In medieval Europe, the sword was consecrated in churches, its blade etched with crosses, turning a weapon into a vessel of faith. To wield a sword was not merely to fight. It was to embody values, whether justice, loyalty, or divine will. Weapons also defined resistance. At the Battle of Haldi Gadi in 1576, Maharana Pratap of Muir fought against the Mughal Empire, wielding a heavy spear and astride his horse Chetak. Though defeated, his defiance became legend, a reminder that even against overwhelming power, the blade could symbolize dignity. In Britain, Boudicca's uprising against Rome used iron swords to challenge imperial rule. In every age, weapons belonged not only to conquerors, but also to those who refused to be conquered. As metallurgy advanced, so did the weapons themselves. Steel, stronger than simple iron, reshaped battlefields. Damascus steel blades, famed for their strength and beauty, spread across the Islamic world. In Europe, the long sword emerged, its reach and weight suited armored combat. Armor and weapon evolved together in an arms race that shaped the Middle Ages. Castles rose, shields broadened, and swords lengthened. The clash of iron upon iron became the heartbeat of feudal society. But behind every weapon was a larger truth. They were never static objects. They were reflections of the societies that made them. In Rome, mass production of gladii reflected bureaucratic efficiency. In Japan, the artistry of the katana mirrored values of discipline and balance. In India, bows and curved blades reflected traditions of cavalry and archery. To study a weapon was to glimpse the world that shaped it. Weapons also carried memory. Heroes and rulers were remembered by the blades they bore: Alexander's sword, Charlemagne's Joyeuse, King Arthur's Excalibur. Whether historical or legendary, each became more than steel. They were vessels of meaning. Stories passed through generations. The blade was no longer just in the hand. It was in imagination. The legacy of weapons was not without its contradictions. They gave security, but also created cycles of war. They unified communities, but also divided them in violence. They defended freedom, but also enforced tyranny. The same sword that crowned emperors could execute rebels. In every age, weapons embodied both the promise and the peril of human power. By the time gunpowder entered the battlefield in the late medieval era, the reign of the blade had already shaped civilizations for thousands of years. Yet even as cannons thundered and muskets cracked, swords did not vanish. They remained on the belt of officers, in ceremonial halls, and in the midst of nations. The blade had become more than a weapon. It had become a legacy, a symbol of human will, resilience, an eternal struggle for dominance and justice. Looking back, the story is clear. What began as a trembling hand striking flakes from stone had become the lineage of empires. Each innovation, the spear hardened by fire, the bow loose from cover, the bronze axe, the iron sword, mark humanity's journey from prey to predator, from wanderers to rulers. The blade was never just metal. It was a thread through which history was stitched. But the legacy of the blade also warns us. Every advance in weapons has carried a cost. The power to kill from a distance when an arrow led to battlefields filled with corpses. The power to arm empires with iron led to centuries of conquest and subjugation. And the step from blade to gunpowder, from steel to cannon, would carry humanity into an age where wars would no longer be confined to kings and armies, but would engulf entire worlds. The blade, however, endures, not as a supreme weapon of war, but as a reminder. It reminds us of where we began, with fear, with survival, with the desperate need to defend against the dark. And it reminds us of who we became, builders of civilizations, bearers of ideals, and wielders of power that has always walked the line between creation and destruction. The legacy of the blade is, in truth, the legacy of humanity itself. Hope you loved it. Smash that like, hit subscribe, and share your location in the comments.